Hello, and a very warm welcome to the latest edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast, which today is going to be looking at some key geopolitical issues. The crisis, the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, Trump's phone conversation with Putin, what President Zelensky has been saying in recent days, what should it mean for EU policy in relation to both Russia and Ukraine, and indeed, given that we are now in a Brexit landscape, how should the UK respond? Well, to help us navigate our way through some of these defence and security issues, delighted to say, back on the podcast for a second time, Stewart McDonald, the former SNP MP for Glasgow South, who led on defence matters at Westminster for the SNP. Good morning, Stewart.
Good morning, Bernard. Good to be back.
Good. So a lot to get through with this because it's multifaceted, lots of different layers. So, Alex, why don't you kick off?
Yes, thanks very much, Bernard, and lovely to have you back on the show, Stuart. Friend of the show, I think
Yes.
we can say. I think we should also clarify to listeners that this is not an emergency podcast because we disapprove of that kind of affectation. But it is a podcast that is going to focus on be a kind of response to recent events. And this has been an extraordinary week, I think, in terms of geopolitics, of American foreign policy and defense policy. Questions over the future of Ukraine, but also of the transatlantic alliance. One of the reasons that we have Stuart on the show is that he's one of the very few Scottish politicians in the last 10, 20 years and so on who has made defence and security concerns their specialty, if you like. And, you know, Stuart, you've spent quite a lot of time in Ukraine. You have plenty of contacts there. You're friends with a good number of Ukrainian parliamentarians, I know. Can you give us a sense of what you're picking up from your contacts in Ukraine in terms of Trump's suggestion that effectively, and correct me if I'm wrong in terms of how I characterize this, that the United States and Russia will come to some kind of peace agreement and impose that on Ukraine. The degree to which Ukraine has agency in its own affairs is now, I think, very much in question. So perhaps we start off, if you could give us a sort of overview of how the situation is seen in Ukraine at present.
Sure, thanks, Alex, and good to be back. I was speaking to a friend of mine this morning who he's now a former Ukrainian MP, works in the Ukrainian government in the kind of energy portfolio, and he's at the Munich Security Conference just now, which I'm sure we'll come to. And the thing that never ceases to amaze me about my friends in Ukraine is that even when things look, dark and a bit hopeless, and that's how it looks right now, they still have a bit of dark humor. And my friend this morning says, we survived this old man one time before, we'll survive him a second time around. But there is no doubt that the second time round is different to the first time round, and they know that. And I think the thing that's horrified them more than anything else, as you mentioned, Alex, is this idea that somehow a deal can be done that can be imposed upon their country. Ukraine has been at this war now for a total of 11 years. In fact, next week will be the anniversary of the 2022 full-scale invasion. And back in 2014, when Putin seized Crimea, he seized parts of eastern Ukraine and the Donbass and Luhansk regions, Russia was controlling around about 8 to 10% of the territory. It's now got about a fifth of Ukrainian land, and all that comes with that. The numbers are difficult to estimate, but it's probably about between 5 and 6 million Ukrainians living under Russian occupation. The numbers are difficult because Ukraine hasn't done a census for a long, long time. And obviously a lot of Ukrainians have fled. And this idea that their land can just be chopped up by Washington, D.C. and the Kremlin in Moscow over the heads of Ukraine, over the heads of Ukraine's neighbouring allies in Poland and the Baltic States and the rest of European NATO, is something that horrifies them. But it's not something that necessarily surprises them. He's going about this, Trump, that is going about this in such a way that he, as he always does, wants to be seen to be making a deal. You'll have seen the suggestion he wants $500 billion worth of rare earth minerals from Ukraine. Something that, first of all, will be problematic because a lot of those rare earth minerals are in the parts of Ukraine that are under Russian control. But he sees this as a transaction, and a transaction is not a meaningful peace deal. There might be a temporary easing of the fighting, a temporary easing of the slaughter, but a sustainable peace deal, I don't think anyone in Ukraine thinks Trump can negotiate without Ukrainians being in the room and without European NATO countries being a part of that. And as an idea of how this has gone so far, you only have to look at what Russia did last night. It sent in attack drones with heavy warheads to hit the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. So it's not got off to a great start.
Stuart, let me put a point to you that to a certain extent what Trump and Putin are up to vis-a-vis Ukraine is almost irrelevant, in the sense that if the Ukrainians are not in the room, there will be no deal, and there is no mechanism for imposing a deal. So in a sense, it doesn't really matter. From Ukraine's point of view, the status quo is what is going to emerge, but the fallout from Trump attempting with Putin to put pressure on Ukraine to settle, which they will not. The real consequence, in a sense, is that this war will simply go on. But if he does try and impose something, there will be a monumental fallout between the Americans and the EU. And therefore, the real consequence of his maneuvers on Ukraine won't actually affect Ukraine, because if they're not in the room, there won't be a deal. But he's risking in the process a whole series of transatlantic relationships.
So that is definitely true. And you're seeing some of that in, for example, the statement that was put out by some European NATO countries yesterday. The UK Defence Secretary, John Healey, has taken over the chairmanship of the Ukraine Contact Group, which is made up of allied countries who send finance and military equipment to Ukraine. And he's been very clear that nothing about Ukraine should be discussed without Ukraine. But the problem is that's exactly what's happening. And although you're right in one sense, Bernard, that they clearly can't impose a deal or a treaty or whatever onto an unwilling people and an unwilling government, they can make life difficult for the Ukrainians. So there could be a real impact in terms of Ukraine's ability to repel the invasion if, for example, Trump decides to remove military and financial support at pace, which I think is clear they're going to be doing. Or he might also want to start a trade war, which he seems to be very keen on at the moment as well. And who knows, he might even impose some sort of sanction on Ukraine. He's agreed in his 90-minute phone call with Putin. They've both agreed to visit each other's countries. So that'll be the first US president since George Bush to visit Moscow. It's the first phone call between the two capitals since 2022. And you can imagine what that discussion between the two leaders will be like. Look at the Helsinki summit, where when Putin said, no, we did not interfere in the 2016 US presidential election, despite all of the US intelligence agencies saying that the Russians did, Trump sided with Putin over his own intelligence community. So he's erratic and unpredictable in that sense. And if Putin has his ear, and I think he has more than his ear, but if he has his ear alone in the room for a period of time, who knows what Trump will come out and impose in Ukraine, if not necessarily, as you say, the outlines of a peace accord.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, isn't it? That American support for Zelensky and Ukraine has been vital for Ukraine's ability to continue the fight since the Russian invasion. Obviously, if you include civilian aid, then the total amount of European aid to Ukraine has more or less matched, or perhaps slightly outweighed, American aid. But nevertheless, it remains the case that in terms of armaments, of ordnance and material for war fighting, the United States has been essential to Ukraine's ability to resist the Russian invasion. And if that is withdrawn, as seems quite possible, and is a big stick with which Washington can threaten Kiev, then that obviously compromises Ukraine's ability to forge its own future. And that, it seems to me, is a clear danger. And also something, as you say, that Trump is already talking about. You're talking about, the outlines of a peace settlement are, I think, quite clear, aren't they? That essentially Russia would keep what it has already taken. There would be some kind of international force, probably EU dominated, to patrol the ceasefire line, if you like. There would presumably be some easing of sanctions on Russia. Trump is already talking today about how Russia should be readmitted to the G7. That is part of a process of normalization of relations with Moscow. It seems to me, the direction of travel is quite clear here, I think. And so if the United States, and the United States has the ability to make things happen in a way that no other country or bloc has, isn't that the case?
Yeah, the US, absolutely. It's a major power. It's a convening power that really is unmatched elsewhere in the world. And yes, obviously, American assistance has been absolutely necessary for Ukraine, and the capital still to be standing today. I should also say it has at times been a drag on Ukraine's ability as well. The entire posture under Biden was give Ukraine enough not to be defeated, but not necessarily to win. And we had this absurd position, for example, where the White House was the sort of last one to agree to allow Ukraine to use long-range weapons to strike military targets within Russia, perfectly legal under the laws of war. So I think we're clearly now in a very, very different phase. It's for a guy who wrote the book, The Art of the Deal, or at least his name is on the book, The Art of the Deal. He's gone out there and handed Putin a whole bunch of stuff before the talks have even really started, because it's worth remembering in the 90-minute phone call, they apparently spoke about a whole range of other things as well. And if you know anything, there's a great book, I forget the author's name, called The Kremlin School of Negotiation. But if you know anything about old Russian and old Soviet negotiating tactics, the last thing you do is walk in and say, you'll get this, 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 and this. Especially so when you're talking about the sovereignty of another country. And I think placing Zelensky as the afterthought, he spoke to Zelensky after his phone call with Putin, is another egregious sign that he clearly thinks he can get a deal. And I think he's clearly in the mood, and the mood music from others, from the Vice President, J.D. Vance, from the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, is that they are minded to wind down in Ukraine. And if they do that at pace, then that will be catastrophic for Ukraine. We've seen this before with the Minsk Accords, which we might get to, and when Trump was in office previously. Russia will use any deal to buy time and come back for more.
Yeah, Hegseth appeared pretty clear yesterday in the statements that he was giving. But let's sort of the scenario in which Ukraine would be in a very, very difficult position is that if there was no more financial aid going to Ukraine, there was no more military aid. At the end of the day, if you're going to fight a war, you have to have the means to fight a war. You have to have the equipment to fight the war. You have to have the money to fight the war. And if the Americans decide that they're going to, in a sense, financially and militarily starve the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, Stuart, do you believe that there are any circumstances in which Ukraine would settle? For example, if the deal was the current land or the current invasion of Ukraine's sovereign territory by Russia, they get to keep what they have, and it's that far and no further. In your view, would that, in the circumstances where really the war is at a stalemate, but it doesn't look winnable from Ukraine's point of view in the sense that they will repel the Russians back from the land which they currently hold, might they be tempted to settle? And of course, I suppose the elephant in the room is what would happen vis-a-vis NATO. Might the Ukrainians be tempted to settle if NATO membership was on the table. But of course, in those circumstances, Russia wouldn't settle if it did look as if there was a path to NATO membership for Ukraine. So what are the circumstances, do you judge, where the Ukrainians might have to entertain an accord out of some form of necessity?
So you mentioned a lot of things there, Bernard, about the means by which they fight the war. They need the money, they need the military resources, they need the people in terms of the armed forces. But the thing they need above all, and which they have in abundance, is national will. Ukrainians don't want to be governed by Russia. And as Russia has found out, it's very difficult to try and seize and take over an entire country when the population doesn't want to be governed by you. The population wants to fight. And although opinion polling in Ukraine, it's obviously difficult, but what it has shown over the past year and a half or so is certainly that there has been a softening of the attitude in terms of coming to a deal, but it's by no means a secure or hefty majority. And I just don't see how President Zelensky or any Ukrainian politician could go to the country and say, after all of the losses, after losing a fifth of the country's land, after Bucha, after what's happened in Odessa, and all of these places, we are going to cede all of this to Russia permanently. So I think what we need to go back to is the old-fashioned idea that it's for the Ukrainians to decide the circumstances in which they come to a deal. And President Zelensky has already outlined how he sees that happening. He's outlined his own 5-point peace plan. And if this is all about, I mean, I'm quite sure that, the US administration is horrified by the sheer brutality. I mean, it's a really, really brutal war in Ukraine. But if money and cost is one of the big factors, then unlock the something like $500 billion worth of frozen Russian assets that exist around the world and give that money to Ukraine in order to finance its victory, which is the single biggest thing that Europe and the US could do to bolster European defense. Because, as I've mentioned, and as history with Putin shows us, if he is given time to regroup and rearm, he will come back for more. So the Ukrainians know that ultimately, yes, a deal will be done, but they're not ready. And there's absolutely no appetite I detect to do a deal on any terms that are flimsy. They've been here before with the Minsk agreements. They're not going to repeat that mistake again.
Yeah, I mean, we'll come on to European and UK defence posture and policy in a bit, I suspect. But if we could just sort of draw back and look at some of the big picture developments and trends, it seems to me that, in the first place, it is quite clear that great power politics is back. Secondly, that the American administration in particular takes the view that might is right. And in that sense, the Americans' default presumption is not a million miles away from the Kremlin's default presumption. This week, I think we've seen quite a lot of people talking about raising the ghosts and the spectre of 1938, of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, and so on. And that's all perfectly reasonable. But I think that Yalta, actually, the Allied conference in 1945 is a better example, because that was the conference at which the United States and a reluctant Great Britain accepted effectively that Eastern Europe in the post-war settlement would be Stalin's plaything. That although we went to war to guarantee Polish sovereignty, Polish independence, Polish liberty, the war was going to end with the crushing of all of those things in Poland. And it seems to me that there is a parallel between Ukraine now and Poland then. But if we look at things from a Russian perspective, one of the things that is quite constant about Putin is that he has been in the business of make Russia great again long before make America great again became fashionable in Washington. If you read the book, I recommend this to listeners who are interested, Putin's People by Catherine Belton, former Financial Times Moscow correspondent. It is quite clear that Putin and his ex-KGB colleagues viewed the 1990s upheaval in Russia as a gross humiliation of Russia, and that everything that Russia has done since then has been to avenge itself against the West, if you like, who it sees as the sponsors and the creators of that humiliation. And so Russian policy since then, I would suggest, Stuart, I'm interested in your thoughts on this and so on, because I may be completely wrong about it, of course, but it seems to me that Russian policy since then has been effectively to wreck the West, to draw a division, or to create a division and then exploit the division between Europe and the United States, to weaken the United States' commitment to European security, to sow confusion and chaos, the old KGB's active measures. It doesn't really matter who they're sponsoring or supporting in any given electoral contest elsewhere in the world. The point is to sow confusion, to suggest that there is no such thing as objective truth anymore, that reality is merely a question of perception, and so on and so on. And so if you look at all of this, then Putin's long game is, as I say, avenging Russia for its 1990s humiliation as he sees it. And so in that sense, the last 6 months, or the last 3 or 4 months and so on in particular, and Trump's return to power in Washington and everything that has flowed from that, because Trump is not doing anything that he didn't say he was going to do. He was quite clear in the election campaign about how he would approach some of these questions, and he is doing what he said he would do. In all of these ways, it seems to me that this has been a tremendous few weeks for Russia in terms of its long-term strategic goals.
Yeah, I agree with every single word of that, and I know Catherine, and
well, that's going to make for a very poor discussion then.
I know Catherine Belton, and would endorse your recommendation of the book to your listeners, Alex. And this has been the best week for Putin in quite some time, and on top of that, he gets Tulsi Gabbard, who's a well-known, Russian conspiracy. Well, she's an American but well-known spreader of Russian conspiracy narratives. He gets Tulsi Gabbard as the U.S. Director of National Intelligence. Now, that's not by any means the most important job in the intelligence architecture in the U.S., but she decides what the president sees, so it's a damn well important job. And she is somebody who is well known to be sympathetic to Russian narratives. But yes, you're right. The entire kind of Russian playbook that has been deployed in the West, whether it's election interference, whether it's disinformation, whether it's trying to sow societal discord and distrust, whether it's straight up killings like we've seen with the Salisbury incident a few years ago, or they've taken out dissidents in other parts of Europe, like in Berlin. This is what Russia does. It wants to sow, feed, and cause as much chaos as possible. So it's not necessarily about getting you to think in a certain way. It just wants to throw so much stuff at you that people become confused, distrusting. They distrust governments, they distrust institutions, they distrust the MSM, the mainstream media, and people retreat into information vacuums, if you like. And there's probably a whole podcast you could do separately on how disinformation spreads and what its effect is. But my goodness, we're seeing it in the cesspit that is X these days. But yeah, this has been Trump's most successful week. Putin's most successful week in a while. A huge wedge has now been driven between Europe and the US. I would go so far as to suggest that Article 5 is practically meaningless. We've even had the odd suggestion of Europe sending in troops to Ukraine to uphold any peace deal. But those troops in Ukraine wouldn't be subject to Article 5. So you would have a situation where if UK troops were deployed in order to maintain the peace in Ukraine and they were attacked, that wouldn't trigger NATO's Article 5, which is an attack on one is an attack on all. But if Estonian troops over their border in Estonia were to be attacked, then that would presumably trigger Article 5. And Trump has made clear in the past he doesn't like Article 5, he doesn't like NATO, he sees it as a means by which America gets ripped off. And it's all the more perverse when you consider that the only time NATO's Article 5 has ever been triggered was to come to the aid of the United States after the terrorist attacks on 9/11. So it's all very much up in the air. But these are new times. Like, the old certainties are just dead. They are dying before us. And we now, all of us, need to rethink about how we approach defense, institutions, governments, political parties. And that will require people to engage in new thinking and get out of some old comfort zones.
Stuart, you've talked about what the response in Ukraine is to Trump and Putin on manoeuvres, and we sort of touched very, very briefly there on the European and British response. But let's just sort of tease this out a little more, because having listened to what ministers in the UK and indeed at a EU level have said, I am not entirely sure what the EU and British response will be. For example, last night on television, I watched Penny Mordaunt do an interview which I regarded as complete and utter incoherence, where this was on Sky News, where time and time again she said, we have to up the ante in relation to this. We have to be much more robust. We have to be much more interventionist. And when not unreasonably, the interviewer said, well, what do you actually mean by that? Do you mean boots on the ground? Do you mean more money? She just kept falling back on a whole series of cliches. And of course, the reason that she would do that is that people haven't been thinking about what a coherent strategy and response should be to this new situation. You also, of course, have the situation where the UK, no longer being part of the EU, has to decide whether or not it's going to march in tune with the mood music in Brussels, or whether or not it takes a different line. Because although on the one level, trade wars have got nothing to do with what the response should be vis-a-vis Trump, Putin, and Ukraine, politics being politics, the British line might be a little bit softer if it looks as if Trump's going to go a lot easier on the UK in relation to trade. So what do you think the response will be that emerges in the coming weeks?
Well, the US messaging, to be entirely fair, is also a bit all over the place at the minute as well. So Hegseth, for example, said no to any troops in Ukraine, no to any air cover for European troops who might be in Ukraine to uphold any peace agreement. And then that was kind of walked back. And we've seen that happen more than once over the past 24 hours. It has been a bit of a clown show on the US side of things. But on the European side of things, I mean, I haven't seen the interview you mentioned with Penny Mordaunt, who I recall when my party's defence spokesman was defence secretary for about 4 months, if I remember right. I mean, I think what needs to happen is, I mean, this we've heard. I mean, I've sat in countless seminars and conferences and debates where we've been told this is a wake-up call. This is the Zeitenwende, as the German Chancellor said in 2022, the turning point. And if you remember, in response to the 2022 invasion, Finland and Sweden did the unthinkable, what would have been unthinkable a few years previously, and ended its policy of neutrality and joined NATO. So there have been big changes, but Europe's never really properly fleshed out, and neither has Britain properly fleshed out. What does it mean in real terms? So yes, you can do more money to Ukraine, and that should happen, and we can do more things like training of Ukrainian armed forces. That can all be ramped up, and all the rest of it. All of these things are good, greater intelligence sharing, and whatever else. But fundamentally, what Europe needs, and this includes the UK, is a new doctrine on defense. The American defense and security umbrella is no longer a certainty. It ain't coming back. Now, that's not to say America won't be there to help or do things in some fashion, but certainly Europe can't be so sure that, if for example, Putin was to cross over into a Baltic state, a NATO member, that America would come to its aid. So Europe, there's been some talk in European circles about, for example, does NATO need a European pillar within it? Does Europe need an army, which is one of the things that have been floated by, for example, Macron, who's talked in the past about the need for greater strategic autonomy in the European states of NATO. And I think he's been proven right in all of that. But these things cost money, and these things take political courage, requires defense spending to go up. It requires governments to have that debate with the electorate about the trade-offs that will be involved. But in the UK, the Treasury will resist as much as possible more money going to defence. Starmer and Reeves need to essentially give the Treasury a personality transplant and end the Treasury's kind of hatred for increased defence spending. And Lord George Robertson, another Scottish politician who made defence his thing by becoming the Defence Secretary and the NATO Secretary General, he's currently undertaking a strategic defence review, which is good. But, I think what needs to come out of that really is the UK anchoring itself in the European security picture. The old Indo-Pacific tilts that were there under Boris and Liz Truss, all of that thinking needs to take a bit of a backseat, and we need to focus on our own continent, our own backyard, and our own national defences.
Yes, because a lot of this stuff has been coming for a long, long time. If we go back to Barack Obama, at that point, the United States announced what it termed a tilt to the Pacific, i.e. away from Europe. So to that extent, it is not it shouldn't be a shock, although it clearly has shocked lots of people, to see Pete Hegseth, the current Pentagon chief, saying that, no, the United States no longer guarantees European security. That is not the game we are in anymore. So this has been coming for a long time. And Trump, to give him his due, is correct, I think, to argue that European NATO countries need to increase defense spending, need to increase their defense capability. And plenty of Americans have complained about Europe's reluctance to do that over many, many years. At the same time, of course, I think it's worth observing that Europe's failure to increase more in defense defense capacity has been to the United States' strategic advantage too. Europe's lack of strategic autonomy, to take the French phrase, has been useful for the United States in terms of guaranteeing, because there's no alternative to it, in guaranteeing American leadership, because Europe hasn't had the ability to act independently. So all of these wake-up calls, it seems to me that, you have one of these wake-up calls every 3 or 4 years, and yet nobody ever actually wakes up.
Absolutely.
You're right. Again, I think, Stuart, to talk about Lord Robertson's defence review, but the word is, again, that the Treasury is not interested in funding what is going to be required. You have the military top brass saying that just to keep things where they are, or where they were before we started shipping munitions to Ukraine, would require an increase in defense spending now to 2.5% of GDP. To create the kind of sustainable armed forces that might be required in the future would require at least 3% of GDP. High by recent standards, but low by historic standards. Even if you look at the 1980s, the 1990s, we were still spending a lot more relatively on defense then. The British Army is now so small and so weak that it is questionable whether it could sustain more than a division in the field, and possibly not even a division, which is about 10,000 troops. So there are big questions here.
No, absolutely. As I mentioned, when I was in Parliament and attended lots of, think tank events and political debates and all the rest of it, and I should get a bingo card made, actually, for all the usual cliches about wake-up calls and turning points and all the rest of it. You would hear this a lot. And what it actually means is, yes, a hard decision on spending, and governments are going to have to be open with the public about what that means. And the interesting thing about the public attitude in all of this, the public attitude right now is probably the most favourable it has been post-Cold War for an increase in defence spending. What the public don't want it to be at the cost of is cuts in the National Health Service or education, for example. That will surprise nobody. If you take an institution like NATO, I mean, NATO has a public approval rating in the UK of 82%, and Scotland, I think it's about 74%. Name me another institution that can claim that. So my sense of these things is that the public is well ahead of politicians, understands this stuff is important. It's willing to have that debate. Spending is only part of it. The other side of it is your, if you like, broader defense philosophy, your broader defense posture. The debate can become a bit sterile, I find, at times, where you just get it's like a spreadsheet debate about percentages of GDP. What we actually need to talk about is capability, and what are we willing to do? What are we willing to do? Are we willing to send troops to Ukraine to uphold any kind of peace accord? Is the UK out of the European Union and going to strike a comprehensive defence and security treaty with the EU member states? It looks likely that will happen, an idea I floated many years ago. So I think there's a major European defence and security debate going on that Britain is undoubtedly a part of, but politicians need to get out of their comfort zone and go out there and make the case for this with the public. But first they need to understand what it is they believe in themselves, because that's where so often the debate can be lacking.
Well, let me ask you what you think the consequences would be of not getting real, as you would see it, in terms of resources, because let me give you two predictions which are driven by political reality. It's nothing to do with security policy, defense policy, foreign policy, setting goals, and so on. The history of strategic defense reviews tends to suggest that what they do is that they buy governments of the day, irrespective of political party, breathing space for not committing resources until the strategic defense review concludes. And I suspect a couple of years down the line, George Robertson will be tearing his hair out saying, why did I do all of that work? Why did I do all that deep thinking? Why did I come up with these recommendations when it was perfectly clear all along that the government were not going to get real about this? And the second thing, and this is where there is a complete and utter overlap with domestic policy, and it's why the Treasury take the view that they take. Given that, what was the growth figures? 0.1% yesterday. Hooray for that. 10 billion of fiscal headroom has disappeared in recent months. The absolute realpolitik here for the government is that they're absolutely thrilled to, more spending for the National Health Service. There is just no possibility whatsoever that they're going to get to 3% of GDP. The Americans probably think it should be closer to 5% of GDP. It ain't happening. So my question to you is, forget it going to 3% of GDP. It ain't happening. And whatever George Robertson comes up with in terms of the Strategic Defence Review, it is likely to gather dust, as they tend to do. And what you will get is sticking plaster solutions in terms of the demands that the MOD will make. What will the consequences be for security policy if the UK continues with sticking plaster solutions?
Well, its capability will just continue to degrade, and the country becomes more vulnerable, and it doesn't have the necessary capabilities to meet the kind of threats that the UK, Europe, and NATO faces today. And there's some politicians would be quite happy for that to be the case. One thinks of Jeremy Corbyn, for example. But on George Robertson, I mean, George Robertson is a deeply serious man. I would hear people say quite regularly that the last time the UK had a decent strategic defence review was the one he led back in the late 90s when Labour came back into government. I've learned a lot from him over my time in Parliament, listening to him and talking with him. And I think he will come up with something. I think he will produce a review that is serious and meets the seriousness of the times we find ourselves in. But I guess you hit the nail on the head, Bernard. If it doesn't have the money attached to it, then it will only be good for gathering dust. And this is where the Treasury needs to have a personality transplant that can only happen with political will. And, John Healey, again, the Defence Secretary, the UK Defence Secretary, is a deeply serious person, but John Healey's not the guy that needs to be convinced. It's Rachel Reeves, it's Treasury mandarins, and probably the Prime Minister himself, actually, as well. And I think we also have to think about, as well as that old institution is the Treasury, we have to think about other ways of supporting our defence posture as well. The NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, gave a speech towards the end of last year where he sort of took head on this kind of view that's become fashionable in financial institutions and pension funds over the years, that investing in defence companies is somehow immoral, which is the sort of thing you expect to see on a university campus and not in the boardroom of major international banks. We can't dine out like the peace dividend, the post-Cold War peace dividend still stands. It plainly does not. If you can't see that this week of all weeks, should have been obvious before now, then my goodness, you're in the wrong job. So I think there has to be, get the strategic defence review right, have an honest and open debate with the public about what that means in terms of the political and financial trade-offs. And I think public perception is in such a place that debate will be far easier to have than politicians often assume.
Well, let's hope so, Stuart. We're coming towards the end of our time. This has been a fascinating, if also somewhat gloomy, necessarily gloomy discussion, I would suggest. I think the bottom line is, if you know, the big picture thing is that this has been a week in which decades of conventional thinking on Western defense, on European and American defense, has been ripped up. So the question of what does NATO do next is secondary in some ways to the first question, which is, what is the point of NATO? Does NATO actually functionally exist right now, this week? You made reference earlier to what happens if an emboldened Russia, which has seen it achieve at least some of its objectives in terms of Ukraine, then decides, well, actually, I fancy a bit of Estonia, a bit of Latvia, a bit of Lithuania, NATO members. What value is attached to NATO guarantees now? It seems to me that President Trump would strongly take, the sort of Bismarckian view. Bismarck once suggested that the Balkans weren't worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. I strongly suspect that is the type of thinking that is now in play in Washington. And so if you lose the essential guarantor of Western security, as the United States now is, and if the United States can no longer be considered a fully trustworthy actor or partner on the international stage, then you have an enormous vacuum created at the heart of the international security apparatus and architecture. And what fills that, it seems to me, is likely to be much less useful, much less encouraging, much less cheering, and much less secure than the kind of guarantees that we have all grown up with, but that are now, this week, suddenly in doubt. There is always a temptation to catastrophize situations, but it seems to me that this really is, or at least has the potential to be, a catastrophic moment in Western security.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the phrase that you can see everywhere. The Antonio Gramsci phrase, the old is dying and the new is struggling to be born. And that's been getting used a lot over the past 3 years. You can see it in the Financial Times. I think Michael Gove used it a lot when he was a minister. You can see it in the pages of the New Statesman. And that really is the time we're in. There are other institutions that are effectively broken as well. One thinks of the United Nations, and in particular the United Nations Security Council. We've obviously talked a lot here about what this means for Ukraine, but just when you mentioned the Bismarck quote, we can't take our eye off the Balkans or Georgia or Moldova, which in a sense, Moscow would see as kind of low-hanging fruit. But I think absolutely there will be an appetite for Russia to continue and increasingly continue to test NATO resolve, to see what does this American retreat really look like in real time, and that is our wake-up call. So I think that the fact we're even posing the question, is NATO really relevant these days, gives you a sense of the time we find ourselves in. But our institutions need to adapt; they need to change. Or we need new institutions, because if we go back to the old rules of might is right, then not only will that be catastrophic in terms of loss of life, it will be far more financially expensive than making the investments in defence today in order to protect ourselves in the years to come.
Just before we finish, Stewart, maybe one point. It has been a truly remarkable week. Comrade Massey is quoting Bismarck, drawing parallels with Poland in 1939. Ben Wallace talking about appeasement, of course, in relation to what Western Europe was doing vis-a-vis Hitler in the 1930s. Neville Chamberlain and his record being gone over in several quality newspapers this week. That really underlines, I suppose, just what an important week this has been, and we shall await the end game with interest and perhaps even with trepidation. There was an end game of sorts for you, Comrade McDonald, last year, thanks to the voters of Glasgow South. The voters have spoken, the bastards, as one American senator once famously said. So, you're not quite a year out of the Westminster bubble. So just tell us a little bit about how's it been, how have you adjusted to it, and what are you up to?
I've adjusted remarkably quickly, is the truth. I think I came on this podcast about a week after the election last time round, and I've made some decisions since then. Back then, Alex asked me if I was going to run for the Scottish Parliament, and I've since ruled that out. I will not be running in any election for the foreseeable future. And as I mentioned back then, I did the traveling that I was intending to do, did a bit of that, and really just took some time off, and then started to kind of talk to some people about what I should turn my hand to next. And, I've got to say, I've been really pleasantly surprised by the generosity of lots of people who would have been my political opponents, taking me for lunches and coffees to give me advice and guidance and wisdom, or put me in touch with contacts that they think could be useful for new work and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's been a refreshing few months. I've enjoyed, the SNP has not been short of drama for the past few years. I've enjoyed not having to get up every day thinking, what the hell do the headlines say today, and worrying about all the internal skullduggery, which we're about to get more of when the selection battles open. So I'm still in the SNP. I still pay my monthly dues to the SNP, but I'm not doing capital P party politics. I'm a non-combatant at the minute.
Well, indeed. Well, wish you best of luck with your future endeavours, Stewart. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's always excellent to hear from you, particularly on defence and security issues. I think ministers have their first glance of George Robertson's Defence Review today, the day we're recording this edition of the podcast. And with luck, we may have Lord Robertson of Port Ellen on the show at some point in the future to talk about his perspective on some of these issues. But it's been great chatting with you. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your expertise with us today.
Yeah, and it only remains, I think, to say keep watching and listening to the podcast. Do recommend it to your friends. And if you are a business who would like to sponsor the podcast, please do get in touch. But for this edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast, a very warm thank you once again to Stewart McDonald. But from me, it's goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me.